Hi, it's Steve Hargadon. I'm here with Reed Hepler. It's Friday, August 30th, 2024, and this is This Week in AI. Hi, Reed.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good.
Awesome.
So we're going to try and be more concise this week and get through things relatively quickly. We know we have a tendency to ramble on.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so this week's news, a lot of news from Google. And I'm probably more of a Google user than you are because I have a Google One account, which gave me access to Gemini Live,
Uh-huh.
and I have a corporate account as well. But Gemini is now available on Android. When I go into my Gmail, I can click on to summarize this email. Apparently, there is a chatbot rolling out that lets me do more than that within Gmail to search for things.
Uh-huh.
Um, on the desktop, you can actually search, which I think you have done. You can search through
Yeah.
Gmail that way. I am using Gemini Live for voice conversations, and I will tell you that I'm disappointed that I haven't gotten the rollout yet of the OpenAI, the promised rollout of a couple of months ago of the upgraded voice.
Yeah.
Um, Although I do believe I'm getting a better experience text-wise with OpenAI.
Okay.
Um, but the I prefer the conversation with Gemini
Okay.
because it's less human. The uncanny
Uh,
valley isn't there. Whatever they've done with Gemini Live, uh, the I know I'm speaking to an AI. It's a human-like voice. It's very nice, but it's not doing the joking or the laughter or the other stuff, which I
yeah.
really appreciate.
It's very more robotic, more formal than the
Well, it's
okay.
not robotic. I think it's just the absence of the human touches. Before, when I had the Scar, no Scar, yeah,
Sky.
was it Sky? The Sky, the Sky voice with OpenAI. Um, it would say and do other things that put me into an uncanny valley or put me into a place of feeling awkward. The anthropomorphizing of the AI in such a human way. And then we saw
Yeah.
the demo, the laughter and the like. Google also announced Google Gems, which I haven't used yet, but it's sort of the equivalent of custom GPTs. I'll probably play with that today.
It's a big
Uh,
week for Google. All the stuff that's rolling
Huge
out.
week,
Yeah. Yeah.
but and very quiet for OpenAI in some ways.
Yeah.
But the what we don't know yet is if you can publish that gem for other people to use. But certainly, if you use it as an individual, it kind of becomes a form of Notebook LM without all of the extra superstructure. Notebook LM has never worked for me well because it doesn't, at least for me, and I know other people have
Uh,
experienced this, it hasn't done a good job of remembering my prompts and the conversation, which bothers me. But so I don't use Notebook LM. But if Gems lets you upload documents, and apparently you can upload video and audio and images as well as text documents to interact with, I feel like Google's doing a really good job of kind of recovering from the early initial problems.
uh-huh.
They also say that they've corrected the um, the image generation of people. That hasn't rolled out yet, but they got criticized a lot for anachronistic depictions of individuals historically.
Uh-huh.
And they say that they fixed that. So anyway, big week for Google. You're right.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how some companies they announce things and they roll it out quickly, and then and they respond to complaints quickly and they fix things. And then OpenAI, they also are very quick, but the voice upgrade thing, like they've said that for months and months and months. So it'll be interesting to see. I think Google will have their the email chat button, the file uploads and such. They're going to roll that out really quickly, and they're going but OpenAI tends to have a months long gap between announcing and actually giving it to people, and
Yeah.
more so with the mobile stuff than with the desktop stuff. Because if with the desktop things, after it's announced, I typically get it in 2 to 3 weeks. But it's been months and months since the updated OpenAI voice thing, and it hasn't been working. But
I think it's been a very interesting summer for OpenAI. A lot of high profile departures,
yes,
sort of all quiet on the Western Front. There's been like a lack of communication. Um, the Sam Altman sort of seems to have disappeared from my radar. I'm guessing it would be really hard to keep the company as aggressively on the edge when you're losing significant personnel or important
That's true.
personnel.
Yeah.
And there's the obvious delays, but also there's been this teasing about strawberry, right? So Sam Altman takes a picture of a strawberry in a garden, and people are like, okay, that's the code word for this new version, maybe ChatGPT 5, that apparently will have more logic in it. Like I've said, my use of ChatGPT 4.0 this past week, it's a really improved experience. I'm so impressed by the ability I have to collaborate from a thinking and writing perspective with ChatGPT 4.0. But if Strawberry is going to introduce more independent thinking or reasoning, and which appears to be a big enough deal that OpenAI or others are saying that they have shown it to the government, which I think, probably this is going to become part of the process now to make sure that because the government has such an interest in the power associated with these technologies. But I think it's possible that we're going to see something this fall, which is groundbreaking. I did feel for a while like they kept trying to get us to think, oh no, this is artificial general intelligence is years away. We're not there yet because, there were stories coming out that it's coming out next year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I do think it's possible that we're going to see something pretty dramatic.
And it'll be intriguing to see what it is because yes, it used to be this is going to come years and years away, and then they had was it like since the spring or was it like June? They had a session, they had a meeting, and I think it wasn't Sam Altman, but it might have been Andres Karpathy of here's our 5-year plan for developing AGI, and we were like 2 or 3 of the years there, like it wasn't really that far off. And yeah, with the strawberry thing, it might be even closer. So
Well, I think they were tempering expectations, maybe
yes,
because there was a little bit of panic. And I
yeah,
think that you can read the departures from OpenAI as people leaving because they weren't comfortable that OpenAI was pushing the edge, pushing the boundaries toward AGI so fast without good guardrails. That's one interpretation of the exodus recently.
yeah,
Okay, so in a fascinating correlation,
uh-huh.
there have been lots of people talking about the difficulty, the inability of large language models to tell you the number of R's in the word strawberry.
Yes,
So,
yeah,
of course, it has 3 R's in it,
yes,
STR, strawberry with 2 R's at the end. Um, and but it's been for me, I've loved this conversation because the explanation is that large language models don't actually work on words the way that we do.
no,
They work on tokens. So words are tokenized. And so the fact that it can't tell you the number of R's in strawberries is because it doesn't actually use the word strawberry. It uses the tokens. I think there are 2 tokens that represent the word strawberry. And so it provides a little bit of a glimpse into how AI large language models work.
yeah,
A lot of mystery for me still, but
it's
I enjoyed that conversation.
yeah, well, and it's intriguing that you have all these people who are so adamant about the strawberry thing being like the ultimate test of AI intelligence, and this is what people are trusting. And then you have people who explain that no, we're tokenizing things, and this is why it's having these issues. And it's interesting to see who believes that and who, well, not believes it, but who accepts that because it's true, who accepts that and who is like, no, I still don't like it. And it seems to me that a lot of educators mostly, and to be fair, I mean, they don't want their students relying on false information, but it's not because the AI is faulty, it's because of the way the AI was trained, because that's how large language models are trained, and that's how the best practice is. So it's not like a manipulative or non-smart thing, it's just a training data thing. It's not a fault. It's
Well,
not a bug um, because you shouldn't be using it like that anyway. So it's a classic example of people trying to use AI in a way that it wasn't meant to be used.
I
So
think we can agree that public conversations exist at several levels, and sort
yeah,
of the surface level of wanting to decide that AI is good or bad.
Yeah.
It's going to be prone to hearing that it can't give you the number of R's in strawberry. And that becomes sort of a hook to hang your hat on to say we shouldn't be using large language models. It's
Uh-huh.
it's at a it's at a shallow level of a conversation, but I get it. People are nervous and scared, and like I was telling you in the pre-conversation, I had an experience with OpenAI this week that was so profoundly helpful that it does not seem possible to me that it's not got some form of sentience. And I know that we're told it doesn't, and I believe that, but
Yeah.
it's so dang good.
Yeah.
And it felt like I was working with the smartest person I'd ever known who really understood me and really helped me create some amazing connections. I'm like, this just feels more than language tokens frequency.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe. So I'm not, if there is a big thing that happens this fall, it will not surprise me.
Yeah.
One of my big concerns is we've idealized and uh, created objectives or goals around AI, believing that they are going to reproduce human intelligence.
Yeah.
And the difficulty I have with that is we are not that smart. And I don't say that in a like a the people are dumb way.
Uh-huh.
We are largely influenced by things that are not rational. So, I'm a student of the subconscious, and we've got this enormous degree to which we are trained through childhood in our culture and in expectations and in conforming. And we have a whole bunch of feelings that could be argued come from our subconscious that are not necessarily in alignment with our conscious mind. And so a lot of what takes place in the world is not because of rational, logical thinking. It's because of human nature. And we call them Darwinian hooks, right? Or
Uh-huh.
triggers. So, people go to war and they get propagandized and they become crowds. And, there's
Uh-huh.
all of this stuff that happens. So it is very intriguing to me that we're trying to create intelligence claiming that it somehow will match human intelligence. And at some deep level, I'm not sure that's actually an accurate statement of what we can expect, right? I think we do want more reason and logic. But the truth is, most people aren't reasonable and logical. That surface level conversation where people want to hang their hat on AI being bad, that happens in all kinds of areas. If we really knew the truth about banking or medicine or the pharmaceutical industry or government, we don't want to know the sausage making steps. We, you
Uh-huh.
know, we just want the end result. And so I am intrigued by the fact that AI has the potential to see things that we are not going to be very good at seeing ourselves. However, we're going to dive deep into a topic related to that when we go to our deep dives.
Yeah.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
so I think we've talked
Very,
about OpenAI. Go
yes.
ahead.
So now we have Anthropic, and they had a really speaking. It's been an interesting week, and this is kind of a smaller announcement in the context of all the other companies, but really it's kind of useful for educators and everybody who's using free Claude. Claude artifacts are now available for free, and that just means that you can and and artifact is something where on the left, on the right side, you have your example, your AI example of what it's making, like your code or your website. And then on the left side, you have your conversation. So you can kind of see, and it's more transparent, what's happening when you're talking about um, when you're
So,
talking about uh, making a website or making a book or making, you can
or a
you can edit
game,
it.
or
Yeah, very, very useful. So really,
yeah.
really cool. Um,
Anthropic also came out in support of the California AI legislation.
okay.
Musk
Yeah.
support. OpenAI has expressed support, and as a part of that, Claude or OpenAI, Anthropic published their instructions. They made as a step of transparency. They indicated the instructions that are being given to the large language model behind the scenes. So I haven't drilled down too much on that, but I do find that really interesting because I do believe more than we know, these large language models are being shaped to match both social and political boundaries. And so I'm really curious to see how much we're going to actually learn about that shaping, the human tweaking and feedback and the instructions that are given. It's not been a very big week for Perplexity, but I still find Perplexity is this incredible tool for me for anything tech support related.
Uh-huh.
And I use it all the time, just to ask questions where I would normally spend 15 minutes to an hour researching something, and it knows, it goes through Reddit, it does all these things that are really valuable to me.
Well, it's more accessible. It has like the links you can click on, and it shows you like what parts of the response came from these sources. All it's really, really useful. Very, very, yeah, transparent about what it does.
I also paid for the first time for Twitter so that I could have access to Grok. And I'm just not using it. So I don't have a lot to say about it, except that it's not by both the like Llama from Facebook and Grok. I, I know they're being touted as being equivalent to ChatGPT, but at least for the kinds of things that I'm doing, I'm really using ChatGPT, Gemini, and Perplexity. And none of them can see Substack articles. So one of the
Uh-huh.
things I've loved is this ability to summarize YouTube videos, to summarize articles. I've gotten through more YouTube videos in the last week than I normally get through in a year. I'm not watching them in full, but in part because a 30 to 60 to 3 hour video on YouTube sits in my to watch later list,
Uh-huh.
and I never get to them. And so I've had several cases where I've gotten the summary of the YouTube video, and then I have been able to um, decide whether or not I wanted to watch the full version. And most of the time, I don't need to. The summaries are great, and it tells me enough about the topic to know, okay, this is the general idea of what's going on here. But none of them do Substack, which is kind of a pain. And I think it's
It's
because Substack.
interesting. I wanted to be so transparent, and so this is going to be easy. This is awesome. It's a website and all these things, but it's not. It's not accessible, yeah, by AI tools. And so yeah, you have to have more manual interactions with it. So much for me being able to
I
contribute
know.
on the, it's just kind of frustrating. But I've started on it now and I can't stop. I have like something like 100 and something subscribers, 120 subscribers, I think now. So I have to keep going on that. But if I would have known that, I probably would have chosen a different site. But anyway, so interesting. But
I bet they'll figure it out. And what I
yeah.
need to test this week is I need to test Medium. Some of the best articles that I'm seeing on AI are coming through Medium, and this is a whole different conversation, not really AI related. But I like Medium's subscription model better than I like Substacks.
Okay.
Meaning, I have to pay for each individual Substack if I'm paying, whereas
Uh,
Medium has a single fee that lets me see all of the paid content. And
okay. Yeah.
there are enough people that I'm really interested in their paid content on Substack, but I don't subscribe because I'd be spending $100, $200 a month, and
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like the right model.
And that's
Some of
what,
them has other issues.
yeah, that's why I have all of, I only make people, have people pay if they want to support me or something, but all of my content is for free because I feel like, why would I do this and then not let people profit from it? Like that's just kind of gatekeeping of my stuff that I'm sharing. So yeah, it is a weird model and that's why I've kind of gamed it a little bit. But yeah, Medium is definitely a more user economical, I would say. So yeah.
I should try one of the Chrome extension tools, pull up a Substack page, and see if it will actually give me a summary from that. Um, I'll do that when we get to these next topics. So, um, $16,000 robot. That little thing looks so amazing.
Yeah.
If that's
Yeah.
true, people are going to buy them.
It reminds me a lot of it was made actually by Honda. Honda made a robot, a household helper called Asimo, named after my favorite uh, author Asimov, and it stands for Advanced Step in Innovative Mobility. It was made in 2000, and it was actually used, and it cost like how much did an Asimo? I want to say it cost like $30,000. But it was really helpful for like medical stuff. Like it was very, very helpful and it could help in diagnosis. But now it it was discontinued. It wasn't really that useful. And so now it's kind of I thought they should have continued and went on with it, but it was a very primitive version of artificial intelligence. And now having current artificial intelligence in a robot for just 16, that's half the price. Like that's really exciting. So I don't think I'm gonna buy it because I have other normal priorities in my life, but it would be really interesting to see if people want to use that type of thing. So yeah.
I'm convinced that the guy I see driving around in my area in that cyber truck is
Uh-huh.
probably going to buy the robot.
It's I yeah, it's and that'll be interesting too because I I'll say this. There was a guy in my neighborhood who he has a Cybertruck. He bought a Cybertruck and he rode it all the time and he drives it all the time. But now something happened and for some reason it started to rust. So now he's driving around this truck that rusts all the time because he didn't think
Oh,
about, or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a rat, but it looks like rust. And so it it just begs the question, if you buy these things, and I'm sure, I mean, they promised it. It's not on him. Maybe it is for letting it out in the rain or something, but I mean, they promised it would be impervious terrain. It makes you wonder if these first robots are going to be actually effective, what testing they're going to go through. Because I know that for household robots, the commercial requirements for using them commercially in houses, safety and all that stuff is very high. So it'll be interesting to see how that is different from a Tesla, an AI enhanced truck.
I
So
think the biggest argument that we live in a simulation is that Elon Musk's SpaceX can produce such incredibly great results going into space, but the Cybertruck looks like a fool's game. It's like, were you dumb enough to think that this was actually going to be valuable or helpful? It
yeah,
just it looks bad. It doesn't look functional. It is the most bizarre thing.
yeah, very strange. Yeah.
Okay, so you want to talk about character AI at all?
Yeah, yeah. So next we have our character AI. This was a not necessarily a news article, but people were talking about it, and somebody wrote a blog post about it. So I thought I would talk about it. Character.ai is having a huge surge in users, and of course, there's all sorts of kind of illicit and non-wholesome uses for things like this. But a lot of times, a lot of educators and people are using it for you talking with historical people. I um, there's actually chatbots, and I've used it twice. There's one for Fraser Crane and one for Niles Crane, and so I've had conversations with them a little bit, and their voices are really, really cool, really, really accurate. Because I'm half convinced that they actually used audio from the show to make those chatbots. But uh, it's interesting how just that need for companionship, that need for, I mean, artificial intimacy or programmed rapport. Maybe we want to call it, artificial companionship. Um, People do it all the time. And it's just interesting that it demonstrates that unless it's being used for educational interactions, and sometimes it is, people prefer talking through text, and it's easiest to do that with an artificial companion. So they use artificial companions rather than humans. So it's just a changing world, like you were saying. It's a changing world, and we're responsible for how we use that. And that's going to be kind of our deep dive of humans have agency, humans have the ability to choose things and influence what the AI tools they use are doing. That kind of dovetails with the message of the human intelligence movement, which talks about, that teachers need to prepare students for an AI world, and our professional productivity principles, which talk about, using AI in the workplace well is going to be a strategic advantage. But it all kind of comes down to our last framework principle of our boot camps. You are ultimately responsible for what happens. So,
I really like that, and I I I wish that we had put in the framework, and maybe we can modify it. This
yeah.
idea I have about generative AI being the answer to the concerns about AI.
Okay.
That generative education is the answer to the problems of generative AI,
Uh-huh.
because Eric Erickson used that as a phrase to describe the life stage where you care about helping other people become competent and capable. And
Oh,
so the idea that um, uh, there is it's really worth teaching about this. Although, again, we've talked about this, the general level of understanding of AI by educators is not going to be high enough, I don't think, for that to be a consistently good teaching moment across traditional public education. um,
yeah. Yeah.
I do want to go back quickly to the Darwinian triggers and chat bots and companionship robots. I really see this happening.
Uh-huh.
And in the same way that I think pornography happened on the internet.
Yeah.
Just too much deep-rooted need, human emotional need for it not to happen. And so I think we're going to be talking about this a lot. I do like this, back to agency. I do like this idea of in this conversation I had with ChatGPT, I was the agent. ChatGPT was a great collaborator,
Uh,
but I was the agent. And framing it that way really helped me to think about how I could discuss this with other people and about the role of humans, right? That I don't think large language models are going to become sentient, although they may be perceived as such, especially by me, right? But I don't think they're built for rational thinking and logic. Of the strawberry example of how many R's in strawberry.
uh,
Um, but I do think that that's coming, and we need to have a good definition of what our role is in the process. Are we just going to be passive agents of large corporations, passive individuals of large
uh,
corporations
yeah.
that utilize these tools, and we're just on the receiving end, or are we agents in using the tools actively to accomplish things that we want to accomplish, and doing so in many cases with much more productivity? Okay, that
This,
was a
yeah, this
week.
has been, this is, yeah, fantastic week. And it's all kind of boiled down to we have a bunch of tools, more tools and abilities coming out. What are we going to do with them? So, yeah, this will be really interesting to see what's going to happen.
And you and I have lots of fun plans ahead. So have a great week, everybody. We'll talk again. Bye now.